The autumn wind carried more than just the scent of burning leaves through Pinewood Valley that October morning in 1872. It carried the acrid smoke of dreams being reduced to ash, the desperate cries of families fleeing their homes, and the thunderous hoofbeats of outlaws who had come to claim what wasn't theirs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you! But it also carried something else entirely unexpected. The determined heartbeat of a young woman who had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger, only to discover that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with wedding bells, but with the courage to stand when everything around you falls. Sarah Coleman had no idea that stepping off that dusty train would change not just her life, but the very soul of a dying frontier town. She came seeking security and found herself in the middle of a war. She came looking for a husband and found herself face to face with a hero she never knew she needed. This is the story of how a mail-order bride and a small-town deputy proved that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships forge the strongest bonds, and that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about choosing to protect what matters most, even when the flames are closing in. Sarah Coleman pressed her face against the train window as the locomotive wheezed to a stop at Pinewood Valley Station, her breath fogging the glass as she took in her first glimpse of what was supposed to become home. The settlement spread before her like a patchwork quilt thrown carelessly across the valley floor. Wooden buildings standing at odd angles as if they'd been planted by someone in a hurry. Smoke drifted lazily from a dozen chimneys, and she could see people moving about their morning routines, unaware that their peaceful world was about to shatter. Her fingers traced the worn edges of William Hayes's letters, tucked safely in her reticule. 3 months of correspondence had painted him as a steady man, a merchant who owned the lumber mill on the outskirts of town. He wrote of his desire, in for companionship, for someone to share the burden and joy of building something lasting in this wild country. Sarah had responded to his advertisement in the Boston Herald not out of romantic notions, but out of necessity. At 24, she was considered well past marrying age back east, especially for a woman with no dowry and no family connections. Her parents had died in a factory fire 2 years prior, leaving her with nothing but a few belongings and the determination to forge her own path. The train conductor, a weathered man with kind eyes, helped her down onto the wooden platform. "Welcome to Colorado territory, miss," he said, tipping his hat. "First time out west?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, smoothing her brown traveling dress and adjusting her bonnet. "I'm meeting my intended husband here." The conductor nodded approvingly. "Fine place to start fresh. These mountain folk are good people, hard-working and honest. You'll find your place here, I'm certain." As the train pulled away with a mournful whistle, Sarah found herself alone on the platform with her single trunk and a leather satchel containing her most precious possessions: her mother's silver locket, her father's Bible, and a small daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dirt streets, and she could hear the distant sound of hammering from what she assumed was the lumber mill where William worked. She had expected him to meet her at the station, but perhaps he had been delayed by business. Sarah decided to walk into town and inquire at the general store about his whereabouts. As she made her way down the main thoroughfare, she noticed the easy way people greeted each other, the genuine smiles and helpful nods. Children played in the dusty street while their mothers hung laundry and chatted over fence posts. It felt like the kind of community she had dreamed of joining, far removed from the crowded anonymity of Boston's tenements. Webb's General Store occupied a prominent corner building, its windows displaying everything from bolts of fabric to farming tools. A bell chimed as Sarah pushed open the door, and she was greeted by the mingled scents of coffee, leather, and spices. Behind the counter stood a plump woman with graying hair and apple cheeks who looked up with genuine interest. "Well, hello there, dear," the woman said warmly. "You must be Sarah Coleman. I'm Martha Webb, and my husband Joe runs this establishment. William told us you'd be arriving on today's train." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Yes, I am. I was expecting Mr. Hayes to meet me at the station, but I thought perhaps he was delayed." Martha's expression grew troubled, and she glanced toward the back of the store before speaking in a lower voice. "I'm afraid there's been some difficulty, dear. William left town 3 days ago on urgent business in Denver. Some trouble with a lumber contract that required his immediate attention. He sent word that he'd return by week's end, but with travel being uncertain these days." The disappointment must have shown clearly on Sarah's face, because Martha quickly continued, "Now don't you worry yourself. We've arranged for you to stay at the Pioneer Hotel until William returns. It's a respectable establishment run by Mrs. Henderson, a widow woman who keeps a clean house and sets a fine table." Sarah nodded, though her heart sank at the thought of spending her carefully saved money on lodging when she had expected to go directly to her new home. "I appreciate your kindness, Mrs. Webb. If you could direct me to the hotel, I'll settle in and wait for Mr. Hayes's return." "Nonsense," Martha declared, coming around the counter. "Joe," she called toward the back room, "come help Miss Coleman with her trunk." A tall, thin man with the impressive mustache emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth apron. "Welcome to Pinewood Valley, Miss Coleman. We're pleased to have you join our community." As Joe hefted her trunk onto his shoulder, Martha linked arms with Sarah and began walking toward the door. "The hotel is just 2 blocks down, and you'll find Mrs. Henderson to be excellent company. She lost her husband in a mining accident 5 years past, but she's built herself a fine business and is one of our most respected citizens." They stepped out onto the wooden sidewalk, and Sarah was struck by how peaceful everything seemed. A few men sat outside the Crossroads saloon, playing checkers and discussing the weather. Women moved in and out of shops, their children trailing behind with hoops and sticks. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The sound of hammering continued from various construction projects around town, evidence of Pinewood Valley's growth and prosperity. "Tell me, Mrs. Webb," Sarah said as they walked, "what sort of troubles have people been having with travel lately? You mentioned uncertainty." Martha's steps slowed slightly, and she exchanged a meaningful glance with her husband. "Well, dear, there have been some reports of difficulties on the mountain passes. Nothing for you to worry about, I'm sure, but it's wise to be cautious when traveling alone these days." Before Sarah could ask for clarification, they arrived at the Pioneer Hotel, a 2-story building with a welcoming front porch adorned with flower boxes. Mrs. Henderson, a sturdy woman in her 50s with steel gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, greeted them at the door. "So you're William's intended," she said, looking Sarah up and down with an appraising but not unkind eye. "I have a lovely room prepared for you on the 2nd floor, facing the mountains. The view is quite spectacular, especially at sunset." After helping Sarah settle into her room and arranging for her trunk to be brought up, the Webbs took their leave with promises to check on her the following day. Alone in the small but comfortable room, Sarah unpacked her few belongings and tried to quell the growing unease in her stomach. She had invested everything in this journey, not just financially, but emotionally as well. The thought of William's absence, however temporary, left her feeling adrift in a way she hadn't expected. That evening, she joined Mrs. Henderson and 2 other guests for dinner in the hotel's small dining room. The conversation was pleasant, focused on local happenings and the approaching winter weather. One of the guests, a traveling salesman named Peterson, mentioned seeing unusual activity in the mountain passes. Groups of riders moving at odd hours, he said, cutting into his beef. Could be nothing, but in my line of work you learn to notice when things aren't quite right. Mrs. Henderson frowned. The sheriff should be informed of such observations, Mr. Peterson. We can't be too careful these days. Sheriff Carson is a good man, Peterson agreed, but he's got a large territory to cover with just himself and that young deputy of his. Speaking of which, I saw Deputy Mitchell earlier today making his rounds. Fine young man, from what I've observed. Sarah listened to the conversation with growing concern, beginning to understand the vague references to travel difficulties that Martha Webb had mentioned. After dinner, she excused herself and stepped onto the hotel's front porch, hoping the cool evening air would help settle her nerves. The main street was quieter now, with most businesses closed for the day. Oil lamps flickered in windows, and she could hear the distant sound of piano music drifting from the Crossroads saloon. It should have been peaceful, even charming, but something felt wrong. There was a tension in the air that she couldn't quite identify, like the feeling before a thunderstorm when the very atmosphere seems to hold its breath. As she stood there, a figure emerged from the shadows near the sheriff's office across the street. Even in the dim light, she could see it was a man wearing a star-shaped badge, making his evening rounds. He moved with purpose, but also with the careful awareness of someone accustomed to watching for trouble. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, and he touched the brim of his hat in a polite greeting before continuing on his patrol. Sarah returned to her room that night with more questions than answers, unaware that just 10 miles away in the mountain passes, a group of armed men was making final preparations for an assault that would test every person in Pinewood Valley's courage and character. Black Jack Morrison and his gang had been watching the settlement for weeks, noting its prosperity and relative isolation. They had chosen their target well, and they had no intention of leaving empty-handed. As Sarah lay in her unfamiliar bed, listening to the wind whistle through the mountain peaks, she thought about the letters from William that had brought her here. He had written about building something lasting, about the satisfaction of creating a life from nothing but determination and hard work. She had come here seeking that same sense of purpose, that feeling of belonging to something greater than herself. She could not have known that within hours she would discover that some things are worth fighting for, not because they are perfect, but because they represent hope itself. She could not have imagined that the quiet deputy she had glimpsed making his rounds would soon become the most important person in her world, or that her own courage would be tested in ways she had never dreamed possible. The wind continued to blow through Pinewood Valley that night, carrying with it the scent of approaching change. By morning, nothing would ever be the same again, and Sarah Coleman would discover that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not when we find what we're looking for, but when we find the strength to protect what we never knew we needed. The settlement slept peacefully under the star-filled sky, its residents unaware that their world was about to become a battlefield, and that survival would depend not on individual strength, but on the bonds forged between strangers who chose to stand together when everything they had built was threatened with destruction. In just a few hours, the real story would begin, and Sarah would learn that courage isn't something you're born with. It's something you choose, moment by moment, when everything you hold dear hangs in the balance. The first gunshot shattered the morning calm, like glass breaking against stone. Sarah jolted awake in her hotel room, her heart hammering as she tried to orient herself in the unfamiliar surroundings. For a moment, she wondered if she had dreamed, the sharp crack that had pulled her from sleep. But then came another shot, followed by shouting voices and the thunder of horses' hooves on hard-packed earth. She rushed to her window and pushed aside the lace curtains, her breath catching at the scene unfolding below. Men on horseback were charging down Main Street, their faces masked by bandanas, rifles glinting in the early morning sun. At their head rode a figure she would later learn was Blackjack Morrison, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness had spread across 3 territories. His dark coat billowed behind him like the wings of some predatory bird, and even from her second story vantage point, Sarah could see the cold calculation in his movements. The peaceful settlement of Pinewood Valley was transforming before her eyes into something from a nightmare. Shop windows exploded in showers of glass as the raiders fired indiscriminately into storefronts. She watched in horror as Joe Webb stumbled out of his general store, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, only to be knocked down by a rider who seemed to take pleasure in the violence. Sarah's hands shook as she tried to process what she was witnessing. This was nothing like the ordered world she had known in Boston, where violence was rare and usually contained. Here, chaos reigned supreme, and she realized with growing terror that she was trapped in the middle of it, with nowhere to run and no one to protect her. The sound of splintering wood came from somewhere below in the hotel, followed by Mrs. Henderson's voice raised in angry protest. Sarah heard heavy boots on the stairs, accompanied by crude laughter and threats. She backed away from the window, her mind racing as she tried to think of somewhere to hide, but the small room offered few options. The door to her room burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall, revealing 2 men whose appearances matched their brutish behavior. The larger of the 2, a bear of a man with tobacco-stained teeth and unwashed hair, grinned at her with undisguised malice. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice thick with an accent she couldn't place. "What do we have here? Ain't you a pretty little thing?" His companion, younger but no less menacing, stepped into the room and began rifling through her belongings with casual disregard. "Look at these fancy dresses, Tommy. This one's got money, or thinks she does." Sarah found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "Please, I don't have anything of value. I'm just a traveler passing through." The larger man laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Oh, you got value, sweetheart. Question is, what are we going to do with you?" Before either man could advance further into the room, another voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. "Step away from the lady now." All 3 of them turned toward the doorway, where a figure stood silhouetted against the hallway light. Deputy Thomas Mitchell had arrived at the hotel not a moment too soon, his service revolver drawn and steady in his hand. Sarah had only glimpsed him briefly the night before, but now she could see him clearly. A man in his late 20s with auburn hair and steady green eyes that missed nothing. There was something about his bearing that spoke of competence and courage, qualities that seemed desperately needed in this moment of crisis. "Deputy!" the larger bandit sneered, though Sarah noticed he made no move to draw his own weapon. "Awful early for you to be making social calls. It's awful late for you to be terrorizing innocent folks," Mitchell replied evenly. His voice carried a quiet authority that made Sarah believe, for the first time since the shooting began, that she might actually survive this ordeal. "I'm going to count to 3. If you're not walking out that door by then, we're going to have a serious problem." The younger bandit's hand moved toward his gun, but his companion grabbed his wrist. "Not worth it, Jake. There'll be other opportunities." They backed toward the door, but the larger man couldn't resist one parting threat. "This ain't over, Deputy. Blackjack don't forget, and he don't forgive. Tell Blackjack he's got 10 minutes to get his men out of my town," Mitchell said calmly. "After that, I start shooting to kill." The bandits disappeared down the hallway, their boots clattering on the wooden stairs. Deputy Mitchell holstered his weapon and turned his attention to Sarah, who was still pressed against the far wall of the room, her face pale with shock. "Are you hurt, miss?" he asked, his voice gentler now but still alert to potential danger. Sarah shook her head, though she wasn't entirely certain that was true. Her whole world had just been turned upside down, and she felt as though she might collapse at any moment. I don't think so. I'm Sarah Coleman. I arrived yesterday to meet my intended husband, but he's away on business. Tom Mitchell, he replied with a slight nod. And I'm sorry to say your husband picked a poor time to travel. These men aren't just common thieves. They're part of Blackjack Morrison's gang, and they've been terrorizing settlements across the territory for months. The sound of gunfire erupted again from the street below, followed by screams and the crash of breaking glass. Deputy Mitchell moved to the window and peered out, his expression growing grimmer by the moment. "How many of them are there?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Too many for one deputy to handle alone," he admitted. "Sheriff Carson is in the territorial capital, testifying in a court case. Won't be back for 3 days at least." Sarah joined him at the window, and what she saw made her stomach turn. The orderly little settlement she had admired, just hours before, was being systematically destroyed. Buildings were burning, people were running in panic, and the bandits seemed to be taking savage pleasure in the chaos they had created. "We have to do something," she said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "We can't just let them destroy everything." Deputy Mitchell looked at her with something that might have been respect. "Ma'am, I appreciate the sentiment, but this is no place for a civilian. My job is to get you somewhere safe, then do what I can to minimize the damage." "Where exactly would be safe?" Sarah challenged. "They're everywhere, and from what I can see, they're not leaving much standing." Before he could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway made them both freeze. Mitchell drew his gun again, positioning himself protectively in front of Sarah. The footsteps paused outside the door, and they could hear whispered conversation between multiple voices. "Back door," Mitchell said quietly. "Move slowly and stay behind me." They crept toward the rear of the hotel, Mitchell leading the way with practiced stealth. The building's back stairs led down to a small alley that ran behind the main business, a district offering some concealment from the chaos on Main Street. As they descended, Sarah could hear Mrs. Henderson's voice from somewhere in the building, arguing fiercely with intruders who were apparently ransacking the premises. The alley was narrow and cluttered with barrels and crates, providing numerous hiding spots, but also potential ambush points. Mitchell paused at each corner, listening carefully before proceeding. Sarah found herself studying his movements, noting the way he seemed to anticipate danger before it materialized. "You've done this before," she observed quietly. "More times than I'd like," he replied without turning around. "Territory life isn't as peaceful as the newspapers back east make it sound." They had almost reached the end of the alley when a figure stepped out from behind a stack of wooden boxes, blocking their path. It was Jake Morrison, Blackjack's younger brother, and this time his gun was already drawn. "Going somewhere, deputy?" Jake asked with a cold smile. "My brother's looking for you. Seems you've got something of a reputation around these parts." Mitchell's hand moved toward his weapon, but Jake was quicker, his gun already trained on the deputy's chest. "I wouldn't if I were you. Drop your iron, nice and slow." Sarah watched in growing horror as Mitchell reluctantly placed his revolver on the ground. She could see the frustration in his face, the anger at being outmaneuvered when so many lives depended on his ability to protect them. "Now kick it over here," Jake ordered. "And you, lady, step away from the deputy. My brother wants to meet you properly." "No," Sarah said, the word escaping her lips before she had time to think about it. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You don't get a choice in the matter, sweetheart. Blackjack has plans for this town, and you're part of them now." Something inside Sarah snapped at that moment. Perhaps it was the casual way he dismissed her autonomy, or maybe it was the realization that waiting passively for rescue wasn't going to save anyone. Without thinking, she grabbed a heavy glass bottle from a nearby crate and hurled it at Jake's head with all the force she could muster. The bottle shattered against his temple, sending him staggering backward with blood streaming down his face. In that instant of confusion, Deputy Mitchell lunged forward, tackling Jake to the ground and wrestling for control of the gun. The two men rolled in the dirt, grunting with effort as they fought for the weapon. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, amazed by her own actions. She had never committed an act of violence in her life, had barely raised her voice in anger, yet something about this situation had awakened a fierce protectiveness she didn't know she possessed. The gun went off during the struggle, the bullet ricocheting harmlessly off a brick wall. Mitchell managed to gain the upper hand, pinning Jake beneath him and securing the weapon. He bound the younger man's hands with his own belt, then retrieved his service revolver. "That was either very brave or very foolish," he told Sarah, though his tone suggested admiration rather than criticism. "I'm not sure there's a difference anymore," she replied, still shaking from the adrenaline of the encounter. They left Jake trussed up in the alley and continued toward the edge of town, where Mitchell hoped to find a defensible position from which to plan their next move. As they walked, Sarah began to understand that her comfortable life in Boston had done nothing to prepare her for the realities of frontier existence, where survival often depended on split-second decisions and the willingness to fight for what mattered. The sound of destruction continued behind them, but Sarah found herself changing with each step. The frightened woman who had cowered in her hotel room was being replaced by someone harder, more determined. She didn't know if this transformation was permanent or temporary, but she could feel it happening, like a butterfly emerging from its cocoon in the midst of a hurricane. Deputy Mitchell led her to a small church at the town's outskirts, a simple wooden structure that sat on a slight rise overlooking the settlement. From here, they could see the full extent of the devastation below, while remaining relatively hidden from the raiders who were still systematically looting businesses and terrorizing residents. "Father McKenna isn't here today," Mitchell explained as they took shelter behind the building. "He rode out yesterday to perform a wedding in Silver Creek. Should be back tomorrow, if there's still a church standing." Sarah looked down at Pinewood Valley, seeing her potential new home transformed into a war zone. Smoke rose from at least 3 buildings, and she could see people huddled in groups, some trying to flee while others attempted to salvage what they could from their damaged businesses. "How many people live here?" she asked. "About 200 counting the outlying homesteads," Mitchell replied. "Good people for the most part, families trying to build something lasting in a hard land." "Like William," Sarah said softly, thinking of her absent intended husband and his letters about creating something permanent in the wilderness. "Like William," Mitchell agreed, "though I have to say his timing could have been better." For the first time since the ordeal began, Sarah found herself smiling slightly. "I was thinking the same thing." They spent the next hour watching the town below, trying to count the number of raiders and assess their capabilities. Mitchell estimated at least 15 men, all well-armed and experienced in this kind of violence. The odds were overwhelming for a single deputy and a woman with no combat experience. "What's their plan?" Sarah asked. "They can't stay here indefinitely." "They'll take what they can carry and burn the rest," Mitchell said grimly. "It's their way of sending a message to other settlements. Submit to their demands or face destruction." "What kind of demands?" "Protection money, usually. Regular payments to keep them from coming back. It's extortion, pure and simple, but it's effective. Most towns pay rather than risk this kind of devastation." Sarah thought about that for a moment, watching smoke rise from what had been Martha Webb's general store just hours before. "But if everyone pays, they just get stronger and more demanding." "Exactly," Mitchell said, looking at her with surprise. "You understand the situation better than most. The only way to stop them is to make them pay a price too high to continue. And how do we do that with just the two of us?" Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, studying the scene below. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a determination that hadn't been there before. "We make them think we're more than we are. We use their own confidence against them." As the morning wore on, Sarah found herself drawn into planning what seemed like an impossible task. She had come to Pinewood Valley seeking a quiet life as a merchant's wife, but fate had other plans. Now she was crouched behind a church with a deputy she barely knew, plotting to save a town that wasn't yet her, home from outlaws who had no regard for human life. The transformation that had begun in the hotel room continued throughout the day. With each plan they made, each observation they shared, Sarah felt herself becoming someone she had never imagined she could be. The helpless woman seeking security was evolving into someone willing to fight for the security of others. Deputy Mitchell seemed to recognize this change, treating her more as a partner than as a burden to be protected. When she suggested using the church bell to coordinate defensive actions, he listened seriously. When she pointed out potential ambush sites that his military training had overlooked, he incorporated her insights into their strategy. By afternoon, they had developed what Mitchell called a plan with a chance. It wasn't much, but it was. More hope than the town had possessed that morning. More importantly, Sarah had discovered reserves of courage and determination she never knew existed. The frightened bride-to-be who had stepped off the train just 2 days before was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for personal gain, but for the right of ordinary people to live their lives in peace. She didn't know if their desperate gambit would succeed, but she knew with absolute certainty that she had to try. As the sun began to set over the devastated settlement, casting long shadows across the smoking ruins of what had been a thriving community, Sarah Coleman prepared to discover just how much courage she truly possessed. The real test was still to come, and everything depended on whether two unlikely allies could somehow overcome impossible odds through determination, ingenuity, and the kind of partnership that emerges only in the crucible of shared danger. The abandoned schoolhouse sat at the far edge of Pinewood Valley, its whitewashed walls now grey with neglect and weather. Deputy Mitchell had suggested they move their base of operations after spotting riders circling the church grounds, and Sarah had agreed, though every step away from town felt like abandonment of the people they were trying to save. The building offered better concealment and multiple escape routes, but it also reminded her of everything that was at stake: the children who should have been learning their letters, the teachers who had invested their hopes in education, the families who had pooled their resources to build something permanent. Sarah pressed her back against the schoolhouse wall, catching her breath after their careful journey across open ground. The past hours had shown her things about herself she never could have imagined. When they had encountered two of Blackjack's men near the old mill, she hadn't hesitated to create a distraction by knocking over a stack of lumber, giving Mitchell the advantage he needed to subdue them both. The sound had been tremendous, echoing across the valley like thunder, but it had served its purpose. "You're getting good at this," Mitchell observed, checking his ammunition while keeping watch through a broken window. His tone held a mixture of admiration and concern that Sarah was beginning to recognize. "I don't know if that's something to be proud of," she replied, though she couldn't deny the strange satisfaction she felt at their small victories. Each successful maneuver built her confidence, but it also highlighted how desperate their situation truly was. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the schoolyard, where abandoned lunch pails and forgotten primers told the story of children who had fled in terror that morning. Sarah picked up a slate that had been dropped in someone's haste to escape, its surface still bearing the careful letters of a young student practicing penmanship. The sight filled her with a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. "Tell me about them," she said, still holding the slate. "The people in this town, what are their stories?" Mitchell settled beside her, his rifle across his knees, and something in his expression softened. Mrs. Henderson lost her husband in a cave-in at the silver mine, but she took his insurance money and built that hotel from nothing. Martha Webb came here with consumption, given 6 months to live by doctors back east. That was 8 years ago, and she's healthier now than most folks half her age. Joe Webb followed her here and fell in love with both the woman and the country. Sarah listened intently, understanding now why their makeshift plan felt so important. These weren't just random strangers caught in unfortunate circumstances. They were individuals who had risked everything to build new lives, just as she had done by coming west. Father McKenna started the school with donations from 3 territories, Mitchell continued. Said education was the only thing that would make the difference between civilization and chaos out here. Doc Patterson delivered half the babies in this valley, including the sheriff's twin daughters. "And you?" Sarah asked quietly. "What? It brought you here?" Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the horizon for signs of movement. "My father was a sheriff in Kansas. Good man, honest as the day is long. He was killed trying to stop a bank robbery when I was 16. The outlaws got away clean and nobody ever paid for what they took from our family." Sarah understood then why Mitchell fought with such determination, why he couldn't simply retreat and wait for help that might never come. This wasn't just about protecting Pinewood Valley. It was about standing against the kind of senseless violence that had shaped his life. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her thoughts, and they both moved to defensive positions without needing to communicate their intentions. Through gaps in the weathered siding, Sarah could see 4 riders approaching the schoolhouse at a cautious pace. She recognized one of them as the man who had threatened her at the hotel, his head now bandaged where her improvised weapon had found its mark. "They're tracking us," Mitchell whispered. Though his tone suggested this wasn't entirely unexpected, Sarah felt her heart racing, but alongside the fear came something else, a cold anger at these men who had turned her new home into a battleground. She found herself checking the small derringer Mitchell had given her, ensuring it was ready to fire if needed. The weapon felt strange in her hands, but no stranger than many things that had become necessary since dawn. The riders spread out around the building, clearly planning to surround it before moving in. Sarah watched through her vantage point. As they dismounted and began approaching on foot, their weapons drawn and their movements coordinated. These weren't random thugs. They were experienced fighters who knew their business. "Back door," Mitchell mouthed silently, and they began, moving toward the rear of the building with practiced stealth. Their partnership had developed its own language over the past hours, built on necessity and mutual trust that had grown remarkably quickly. They slipped out of the schoolhouse just as the first bandit reached the front entrance, but their escape route led directly into the second challenge of the day. The school had been built near Silver Creek, and the autumn rains had swollen the normally placid stream into a torrent of muddy water that rushed between steep banks with dangerous force. "Can you swim?" Mitchell asked, though the question seemed academic given their limited options. "Not well," Sarah admitted, looking at the churning water with growing dread, "and certainly not in these clothes." Behind them, they could hear the bandits searching the schoolhouse, their voices growing more frustrated as they realized their quarry had escaped. It would only be moments before they thought to check the rear of the building. Mitchell began, fashioning a crude rope from leather strips and clothing, tying one end around his waist and the other around Sarah's. "Stay close to me," he instructed. "The current is strong, but it's not impossible. The key is not to fight it. Let it carry you downstream and angle toward the far bank." Sarah nodded, though privately, she wondered if she would have the strength to follow his instructions once they entered the water. The creek looked treacherous, full of hidden rocks and debris that could easily trap or injure them. but the sound of boots on wooden floors behind them made the choice academic. They entered the water together, and immediately Sarah understood why Mitchell had looked so grim. The current was not just strong, it was overwhelming, pulling at her heavy skirts and threatening to drag her under with each step. The cold shocked her system, making it difficult to breathe, and within moments she had lost all feeling in her hands and feet. Mitchell's strength proved crucial as they fought their way across the creek. More than once, Sarah felt herself being swept away, only to be pulled back by their improvised lifeline. Her traveling dress, so carefully chosen for making a good impression on her intended husband, became a waterlogged burden that seemed determined to drown her. Halfway across, Sarah's foot caught between two submerged rocks, and she went under, completely. The world became a confused tumble of rushing water and panicked thoughts as she struggled to find the surface. Mitchell's hand found her arm and hauled her up, but not before she had swallowed what felt like half the creek. "Stay with me," he urged, his voice barely audible over the sound of the water. "We're almost there." The final yards to the opposite bank required every ounce of strength Sarah possessed. Her muscles screamed with fatigue, her lungs burned from the cold water she had inhaled, and her vision began to blur from exhaustion. But Mitchell's steady presence and the knowledge that surrender meant capture kept her moving forward. They collapsed on the muddy bank, gasping and shivering, just as the first bandit appeared at the schoolhouse's rear door. The man looked across the creek at them with obvious frustration, but the water was too dangerous for pursuit without proper equipment. "This ain't over," he shouted across the torrent. "Blackjack don't give up easy." Mitchell raised himself on one elbow and called back, "Tell Blackjack that Tom Mitchell is still here and I'm not going anywhere." The exchange seemed to satisfy some need for defiance in both men, and the bandit disappeared back into the schoolhouse. Sarah and Mitchell began the difficult process of wringing out their clothes and assessing their situation. "That was terrifying," Sarah admitted, though she was surprised to find herself smiling despite their circumstances. "That was courage," Mitchell corrected. "There's a difference between not being afraid and acting despite fear." They took shelter in a grove of cottonwood trees while their clothes dried, and Sarah found herself thinking about the woman she had been just days before. That person seemed like a stranger now, someone whose biggest concern had been whether her traveling dress would make the right impression on a husband she had never met. The third trial came as they worked their way back toward town through the gathering dusk. They had been moving carefully through a stand of pine trees when Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of a bear crashing through the underbrush nearby. Mitchell immediately motioned for her to freeze, his hand moving to his rifle with practiced efficiency. The animal that emerged from the trees was enormous, a black bear that must have weighed over 400 pounds. It had clearly been disturbed, from its foraging by their approach, and its small eyes fixed on them with the kind of attention that suggested they were being evaluated as potential threats. Sarah felt terror rise in her throat, but alongside it came something else, a strange calm that seemed to settle over her in moments of extreme danger. She had noticed this phenomenon during their other encounters, a clarity of thought that emerged when immediate action was required. Mitchell raised his rifle slowly, but Sarah could see his reluctance to fire. A gunshot would alert every bandit in the valley to their location, potentially ending their mission before it had truly begun. The bear, meanwhile, continued its evaluation, occasionally rising on its hind legs to get a better view of these intruders in its territory. "Move very slowly toward that fallen log," Mitchell whispered, indicating a large pine that had toppled in some past storm. No sudden movements, no eye contact. They began inching toward the makeshift shelter, their progress agonizingly slow as the bear continued to watch them. Sarah found herself counting her heartbeats, using the rhythm to maintain her composure. As they covered the 15 yards that felt like 15 miles, the bear's decision came suddenly, Instead of charging or retreating, it simply lost interest and ambled away into the deeper woods, apparently concluding that they posed no threat to its evening meal. Sarah and Mitchell remained frozen until the sound of its passage faded completely. "I thought we were going to die," Sarah whispered, once they were certain the animal had gone. "So did I," Mitchell admitted, "but you kept your head. Not everyone would have managed that." As they resumed their journey toward town, Sarah reflected on how much she had changed in just one day. The morning had found her a frightened woman, hiding in a hotel room, dependent on others for protection and guidance. Now she was moving through dangerous territory as an equal partner, making life and death decisions with confidence she never knew she possessed. The final challenge of the day came as they reached the outskirts of Pinewood Valley. The settlement looked even worse in the fading light, with several buildings now reduced to smoking ruins and debris scattered throughout the streets. But what caught Sarah's attention was the systematic nature of the destruction. This wasn't random violence, but calculated intimidation. "They're trying to break the spirit of the place," she observed, studying the pattern of damage. "Exactly," Mitchell agreed. "Fear is their most effective weapon. If they can convince people that resistance is hopeless, they've won without firing another shot." They found shelter in the ruins of what had been the town's small library, its books scattered and trampled, but its stone foundation still solid. From here, they could observe the bandits' movements and plan their next actions. As they settled in for the night, Sarah realized that each trial they had faced had taught her something essential. The creek crossing had shown her that physical limitations could be overcome through determination and partnership. The bear encounter had revealed reserves of calm courage she never knew she possessed. The constant threat of pursuit had taught her to think strategically, to see patterns and possibilities that her former self would have missed entirely. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked, though she wasn't certain she wanted to know the answer. Mitchell checked his weapons methodically, a ritual she was beginning to recognize. "Tomorrow we find out if we're strong enough to save this town, or if Blackjack Morrison finally gets his way." Sarah nodded, understanding that their trials had been preparation for something larger and more dangerous. But as she settled against the stone wall of the ruined library, surrounded by the scattered dreams of a community that had dared to believe in education and progress, she felt something she hadn't expected. Anticipation. The frightened mail-order bride was gone, replaced by someone who understood that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, greater dangers, and possibly the end of everything they were trying to protect. But tonight, Sarah Coleman fell asleep, knowing that she had discovered something precious in the crucible of adversity. The knowledge that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. The woman who had stepped off the train seeking security had found something infinitely more valuable: the strength that comes from standing up for others, the confidence that emerges from facing impossible odds, and the partnership that develops when two people discover they are willing to risk everything for principles larger than themselves. Outside, the wind carried the scent of smoke and destruction across the valley. But inside the ruins of the library, two allies prepared for the battle that would determine not just their own fate, but the future of everyone who had dared to dream of building something lasting in the wilderness. Dawn broke over Pinewood Valley like a crimson warning, the sky painted red with smoke and the promise of violence. Sarah woke to find Deputy Mitchell already positioned at their makeshift observation post, his weathered hands steady on his rifle as he studied the settlement below. The night had brought little rest for either of them, filled as it was with the distant sounds of destruction and the knowledge that today would determine everything. The bandits had not been idle during the hours of darkness. Blackjack Morrison, had positioned his men with military precision throughout the town, turning what had once been a peaceful community into a fortified stronghold. Sarah could see sentries posted at every major intersection, their weapons glinting in the early morning light as they maintained watch over their conquered territory. 15 men, Mitchell murmured, his voice barely audible even in the pre-dawn stillness. All of them experienced fighters, all of them loyal to Blackjack's brand of brutality. Sarah nodded, her own eyes tracking the movement patterns they had observed throughout the night. She had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated where the bandits felt most confident and where they seemed nervous or uncertain. This knowledge had become second nature to her, though she marveled at how quickly survival skills could develop when necessity demanded it. "The hostages are being held in 3 locations," she observed, pointing toward the structures they had identified. Webb's General Store, the Crossroads Saloon, and what's left of the grain elevator. The sight of those buildings filled Sarah with a mixture of anger and determination. Inside each one were people she had begun to think of as neighbors and friends, despite having known them for only days. Martha Webb, with her kind eyes and generous spirit, Mrs. Henderson, who had welcomed a stranger with such warmth, Doc Patterson, whose gentle hands had brought so many children safely into the world. Blackjack Morrison himself had taken up residence in the sheriff's office, a calculated insult that spoke to his arrogance and his confidence in ultimate victory. From their vantage point in the library ruins, Sarah could occasionally glimpse his distinctive silhouette moving past. The windows and each sighting filled her with a cold fury she had never experienced before. "He thinks he's already won," she said, watching the outlaw leader's casual movements through the office that should have belonged to law and justice. "That's what we're counting on," Mitchell replied grimly. "Overconfidence has been the downfall of better men than Blackjack Morrison." Their plan, developed through hours of careful observation and desperate creativity, relied on timing, misdirection, and the kind of coordinated action that seemed impossible for just 2 people to execute. But Sarah had ceased believing in impossibility somewhere between the creek crossing and the bear encounter. Now she believed only in necessity and the willingness to do whatever was required. The first phase began as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, casting long shadows across the valley floor. Sarah made her way through the network of drainage ditches and abandoned root cellars that honeycombed the area behind the main street, her movement carefully timed to avoid the bandits' patrol routes. Her destination was the grain elevator, where 6 townspeople were being held under guard by 2 of Morrison's men. The elevator had been damaged in the initial attack, its wooden sides splintered by gunfire and one corner blackened by fire. But its basic structure remained sound, and more importantly, it offered multiple levels and hiding places that could be used to tactical advantage. Sarah had volunteered for this assignment despite Mitchell's objections, arguing that her smaller size and unfamiliar face made her the logical choice for infiltration. As she approached the building's rear entrance, Sarah felt the familiar calm settling over her, the strange clarity that had become her companion in moments of extreme danger. Her hands were steady as she checked the small arsenal Mitchell had provided, the derringer, 2 throwing knives he had taught her to use during their brief training session, and a collection of improvised weapons that would have seemed absurd to her former self. The guard at the rear door was young, probably no more than 20, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was new to this line of work. Sarah watched him from concealment, noting his habits and timing his movements. He smoked hand-rolled cigarettes, taking long drags while his attention wandered to the mountains in the distance. Perfect. She waited for him to light his next cigarette, then stepped into the open with her hands raised in apparent surrender. The guard's reaction was exactly what she had hoped for. surprise, followed by the kind of male confidence that assumed a lone woman posed no threat. "Well, well," he drawled, crushing his cigarette under his boot. "Look what we got here. You're that fancy lady from the hotel, ain't you?" "Please," Sarah said, allowing her voice to shake with carefully calculated fear. "I've been hiding in the woods all night. I'm cold and scared, and I just want this to be over." The guard's grip on his rifle relaxed slightly as he stepped closer. Exactly as Sarah had predicted, men like this one saw women as objects to be collected rather than people to be respected, and that blindness would be his undoing. "Now, don't you worry, sweetheart," he said, reaching out to grab her arm. "We'll take real good care of you." Sarah waited until his hand made contact, then struck with the throwing knife Mitchell had taught her to conceal in her sleeve. The blade found the nerve cluster in his wrist, causing him to drop his weapon with a cry of pain and surprise. Before he could recover, she had retrieved his rifle and was pointing it at his chest with hands that no longer trembled. "Call out to your partner," she instructed quietly. "Tell him you need help with something. Do it naturally, or I'll shoot you where you stand." The guard's eyes widened as he realized his mistake, but Sarah's steady gaze and unwavering aim convinced him to comply. His partner appeared moments later, walking directly into the trap Sarah had prepared. A quick blow with the rifle butt rendered him unconscious, and suddenly she was in control of the grain elevator. The hostages inside looked at her with a mixture of hope and disbelief as she quickly freed them from their bonds. Martha Webb was among them, her usually pristine appearance disheveled, but her spirit clearly unbroken. "Sarah, dear," Martha whispered, embracing her with tears in her eyes. "We thought you were dead. How did you manage this?" "I learned from a good teacher," Sarah replied, thinking of Mitchell and hoping he was having equal success with his own assignments. "Now we need to move quickly. Can everyone walk?" The group included 2 elderly men, a young mother with her infant son, and Martha Webb herself. None of them were fighters, but all of them were survivors who had endured the hardships of frontier life. Sarah organized them quickly, assigning tasks and escape routes based on each person's abilities. "The plan is to reach the church," she explained. "Deputy Mitchell will meet us there with the other hostages, but we have to move carefully and stay together." Leading the rescued hostages through the maze of back alleys and damaged buildings proved more challenging than Sarah had anticipated. The baby cried intermittently, threatening to alert nearby guards, and one of the elderly men struggled with a leg injury sustained during his capture. But Sarah found herself adapting to each obstacle, drawing on reserves of patience and leadership she had never known she possessed. They had almost reached the church when disaster struck. A patrol of 3 bandits rounded a corner directly ahead of them, blocking their escape route with drawn weapons. Sarah's heart sank as she realized their careful planning had been undone by simple bad luck. "Well, looky here," the lead bandit called out, his voice carrying the kind of cruel amusement that Sarah had learned to hate. "The little bird has been busy." Sarah positioned herself between the bandits and the hostages, her captured rifle ready, despite the hopeless odds. "Let them go," she said clearly. "Your fight is with the law, not with innocent people." The bandit laughed, but there was something in Sarah's bearing that made him pause. This wasn't the frightened woman who had cowered in the hotel room. This was someone who had been tested by fire and emerged transformed. "You got backbone, lady. I'll give you that," he admitted. "But backbone don't stop bullets." Before he could raise his weapon, the sharp crack of a rifle echoed from the direction of the sheriff's office, followed by shouting voices and the sound of running feet. Mitchell's part of the plan was clearly underway. Drawing attention away from their position, Sarah seized the moment of distraction to act. Instead of retreating or surrendering, she charged forward, using the element of surprise to knock the lead bandit off balance. The other hostages, inspired by her example, joined the fight with whatever weapons they could find. Martha Webb proved particularly effective with a broken fence post, while one of the elderly men demonstrated surprising agility for someone his age. The brief but vicious melee ended with two bandits unconscious, and the third fleeing toward the main street, shouting warnings about the escaped hostages. Sarah gathered her charges and resumed their desperate journey to the church, knowing that their cover was now completely blown. They reached the sanctuary just as Deputy Mitchell arrived with his own group of rescued townspeople, including Mrs. Henderson and Doc Patterson. The reunion was emotional but brief, as the sound of approaching riders made it clear that Blackjack Morrison was mobilizing his remaining forces for a final assault. "How many did we account for?" Mitchell asked, quickly checking his ammunition. "5 down for certain," Sarah replied, pleased by how naturally tactical thinking had become for her. "Maybe 7 if the ones at the saloon are still unconscious." "That leaves 8 or 9 plus Blackjack himself," Mitchell calculated. "Still long odds, but better than we started with." The church, with its solid stone foundation and commanding view of the surrounding area, had been chosen as their final defensive position for good reason. Mitchell had prepared it during the night, creating firing positions and stockpiling ammunition taken from their various encounters. But Sarah could see the worry in his eyes as he surveyed their mixed force of townspeople and rescued hostages. "Most of these folks have never been in a gunfight," he said quietly. "When Morrison comes, it's going to be brutal." Sarah looked around at the faces of the people they had rescued, seeing fear but also determination in their expressions. These were individuals who had risked everything to build new lives in an unforgiving land, and they weren't prepared to surrender those dreams without a fight. "Then we make sure they don't have to fight alone," she said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the harsh voices of men who had spent the night having their authority challenged and their plans disrupted. Blackjack Morrison was coming, and he was bringing everything he had left. Sarah took her position at one of the church windows, the rifle steady in her hands as she prepared for the battle that would determine not just their survival, but the future of everything they had fought to protect. The frightened mail-order bride was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. Outside, the sound of approaching violence grew closer with each passing moment. Inside the church, 24 people prepared to make their stand, led by an unlikely partnership between a deputy who had never forgotten his father's example and a woman who had discovered that strength comes not from security, but from the willingness to risk everything for principles larger than oneself. The ultimate test was about to begin, and Sarah Coleman was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that she had already won the most important victory of all, the battle to become the person she was truly meant to be. The new beginning black. Jack Morrison rode into the church grounds like death itself, his long coat billowing behind him as his horse kicked up clouds of dust in the morning light. 8 riders flanked him, their weapons drawn and their faces set in the hard lines of men who had made violence their profession. But there was something different in their leader's demeanor now, a fury that spoke of plans gone wrong and authority challenged in ways he had never experienced before. Sarah watched from her position at the sanctuary window, her finger steady on the rifle trigger as she tracked Morrison's movements. The man who had terrorized 3 territories sat his horse with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to instant obedience, but she could see the tightness around his eyes that betrayed his growing frustration with the day's unexpected developments. "People of Pinewood Valley," Morrison called out, his voice carrying easily across the open ground between his position and the church. "You've caused me considerable inconvenience today. That ends now." Deputy Mitchell stepped into the church. doorway, his badge catching the sunlight as he positioned himself where Morrison could see him clearly. "Jack Morrison!" he called back, his voice calm but carrying an authority that made several of the outlaws' men shift nervously in their saddles. "You're under arrest for murder, robbery, and terrorizing innocent citizens. Surrender now, and you'll live to see trial." Morrison's laughter was like breaking glass, sharp and dangerous. "You're outnumbered and outgunned, deputy. Look around you. This town is finished, and everyone in that church is going to burn with it unless you come out with your hands up." "Take a good look yourself, Morrison," Sarah said, stepping into view beside Mitchell. The sight of her seemed to genuinely surprise the outlaw leader, and she took satisfaction in the brief confusion that crossed his face. "Count your men again. We've been busy since yesterday." It was true. The 8 riders who had accompanied Morrison represented less than half of his original force, and Sarah could see the moment when he realized that his supposedly easy conquest had cost him dearly. The confidence that had carried him through years of successful raids wavered as he confronted the reality of genuine resistance. "You killed my brother," Morrison said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than his earlier shouts. "Your brother tried to murder innocent people," Mitchell replied evenly. "He made his choice, just like you're making yours now." The standoff stretched taut between them, 40 yards of open ground that might as well have been a battlefield. Sarah could feel the tension building like pressure before a thunderstorm, and she knew that when it broke, everything would happen very quickly. Morrison's decision came without warning. Instead of ordering a charge or attempting further negotiation, he drew his revolver and fired directly at Mitchell. The deputy dove sideways, but not quickly enough to avoid the bullet that creased his shoulder, sending him stumbling against the church door frame. Sarah's response was instantaneous and deadly accurate. Her rifle shot took Morrison's horse in the chest, sending both animal and rider crashing to the ground in a tangle of limbs and dust. The outlaw leader rolled free of the dying animal, but his fall had clearly stunned him, and his weapon had been knocked from his grasp. The battle erupted with the sudden violence of a prairie fire. Morrison's remaining men charged toward the church, their guns blazing, while the defenders inside returned fire from windows and doorways. Sarah found herself moving with practiced efficiency from position to position, her shots carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. Martha Webb had armed herself with a shotgun and proved surprisingly accurate for someone who claimed to have never fired a weapon in anger. Doc Patterson, despite his advancing years, demonstrated the steady hands that had served him well in surgery as he methodically picked off targets with an old military rifle. Even Mrs. Henderson contributed to the defense, loading weapons and tending to wounded with equal skill. But it was Sarah who became the focal point of the resistance, moving through the church with deadly purpose as she coordinated their defensive efforts. When 2 bandits tried to flank their position by approaching through the cemetery, she was there to meet them with rifle fire that sent them scrambling for cover. When another attempted to set fire to the building's wooden sections, her accurate shooting convinced him to abandon the effort. Mitchell, despite his wounded shoulder, continued to direct the overall defense while keeping Morrison pinned down behind the carcass of his horse. The outlaw leader had retrieved his weapon and was returning fire, but his position offered little protection, and his ammunition was clearly running low. "Surrender, Morrison," Mitchell called out during a brief lull in the gunfire. "Your men are dead or running. It's over." "Never," Morrison snarled back, though Sarah could hear the desperation creeping into his voice. "I've got nothing left to lose." That statement proved prophetic in ways Morrison hadn't intended. Rising from behind his makeshift shelter, he made a desperate rush toward the church, firing wildly as he ran. Sarah and Mitchell both aimed at the charging figure, but it was Sarah's shot that found its mark, striking Morrison's center mass and sending him spinning to the ground. The sudden silence that followed seemed almost unnatural after the chaos of battle. Smoke drifted across the churchyard, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air. Of Morrison's 8 riders, 3 lay motionless in the dust, 2 more were wounded and calling for medical attention, and the remaining 3 had fled toward the mountain passes when the tide of battle turned against them. Sarah lowered her rifle, her hands beginning to shake now that the immediate danger had passed. The transformation that had begun with her arrival in Pinewood Valley was complete, but the woman who stood in the church doorway bore little resemblance to the frightened bride-to-be who had stepped off the train just days before. Mitchell approached, Morrison's still form cautiously, his weapon ready, despite the apparent finality of the outlaw's wounds. But there was no deception in the man's stillness. Blackjack Morrison's reign of terror across 3 territories had finally ended in the dusty churchyard of a small Colorado settlement. "Is he dead?" Martha Webb asked quietly, though the answer was obvious to everyone present. "Yes," Mitchell replied, holstering his weapon. "It's finished." The word seemed to release something in the assembled townspeople, and suddenly everyone was talking at once, relief and exhaustion combining in voices that ranged from whispers to near shouts. Sarah found herself at the center of a crowd of people wanting to express their gratitude, but their words seemed to come from a great distance as the full impact of recent events began to settle over her. Doc Patterson insisted on examining both Sarah and Mitchell for injuries, fussing over the deputy's wounded shoulder while marveling at Sarah's apparent lack of serious harm despite her active role in the fighting. "Young lady," he said seriously, "I've seen seasoned soldiers who didn't handle combat as well as you did today." "I had a good teacher," Sarah replied, glancing toward Mitchell with something that might have been affection mixed with respect. The cleanup and recovery efforts that followed occupied the remainder of the day. The surviving bandits were secured in the town's small jail, though 2 of them required Doc Patterson's medical attention before they could be properly confined. Bodies were buried, property damage was assessed, and the long process of rebuilding began almost immediately. Sarah found herself naturally assuming a leadership role in these efforts, coordinating relief supplies and helping families assess what could be salvaged from their damaged homes and businesses. It felt strange to be making decisions about a community she had known for less than a week, but the townspeople seemed to accept her authority as naturally as she had assumed it. As evening approached, she and Mitchell found themselves alone, on the church steps, watching the sun set over a valley that was finally at peace. The deputy's arm was in a sling, but his wound was minor compared to what might have happened if Sarah's aim had been less accurate. "What happens now?" she asked, though she wasn't entirely certain what answer she hoped to hear. "Now we rebuild," Mitchell said simply. "The territorial governor will want a full report, and there'll probably be some kind of recognition for what you did here. You saved this town, Sarah. You saved all of us." Sarah shook her head slowly. "We saved it. Together." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts about the events that had transformed them both. Finally, Mitchell spoke again, his voice careful and tentative. "William Hayes will be back soon," he said. "Your intended husband. You'll have decisions to make." Sarah had been thinking about William's return throughout the day, trying to imagine resuming the life she had planned before everything changed. The prospect felt strange now, like trying to wear clothes that no longer fit properly. "I've been thinking about that," she admitted. "The woman who agreed to marry William Hayes doesn't exist anymore. I'm not sure the woman I've become is what he bargained for." Mitchell turned to look at her, something hopeful flickering in his expression. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Maybe the woman you've become is exactly what this territory needs." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. But these weren't the threatening hoofbeats of raiders. These were the measured sounds of legitimate travelers. A small group of riders was approaching the church, led by a man in a business suit who looked distinctly out of place in the saddle. "William Hayes," Mitchell said quietly, recognizing the newcomer from previous encounters in town. Sarah felt a strange detachment as she watched her intended husband dismount and approach the church. He was exactly as she had imagined from his letters, solid, respectable, and clearly uncomfortable with the signs of recent violence that surrounded them. "Miss Coleman," William said formally, removing his hat as he climbed the church steps. "I returned as soon as I received word about the troubles here. Are you unharmed?" "I'm fine, Mr. Hayes," Sarah replied, studying his face for some sign of the man she had expected to marry, "though I'm afraid the troubles, as you call them, have changed things considerably." William's eyes moved from Sarah to Mitchell and back again, clearly trying to understand the dynamics of what he was observing. "Changed things how?" Sarah stood, smoothing her torn and stained dress with hands that still bore traces of gunpowder. "I'm not the same woman who answered your advertisement, Mr. Hayes. The past few days have shown me things about myself that I never knew existed. I'm not sure I'm suited for the quiet life of a merchant's wife anymore." William frowned, his businessman's mind clearly struggling to process this unexpected development. "Miss Coleman, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience, but surely once things return to normal." "This is normal," Sarah interrupted gently. "This is what life is like out here. It requires a kind of strength and partnership that I'm not sure we could provide for each other." The conversation that followed was awkward, but civil, as Sarah and William came to the mutual understanding that their arrangement was no longer suitable for either of them. He was a good man, seeking a conventional wife, while she had become someone who needed a different kind of partnership entirely. After William's departure, Sarah and Mitchell resumed their positions on the church steps, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. The silence between them was different now, charged with possibilities that hadn't existed before. "So, what will you do?" Mitchell asked eventually. Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of freedom she had never experienced before. "I think I'll stay. In Pinewood Valley. This town is going to need rebuilding, and I've discovered I'm good at organizing people and getting things done. Mrs. Henderson has offered me a partnership in the hotel, and Martha Webb wants help expanding the general store." "And personally?" Mitchell asked carefully. Sarah turned to face him fully, seeing in his expression the same mixture of hope and uncertainty she felt in her own heart. "Personally, I think I found something more valuable than security or convention. I found someone who sees me as an equal partner, someone who trusts me to stand beside him when things get difficult." Mitchell's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Tom Mitchell," he said formally, as if they were meeting for the first time. "Deputy Sheriff, and hopefully something more if you're interested." "Sarah Coleman," she replied, taking his offered hand. "Former mail order bride, current defender of Pinewood Valley, and very much interested in whatever comes next." The woman who had arrived on the train seeking security had found something infinitely more precious: the knowledge that true strength comes not from being protected, but from being willing to protect others. She had discovered that the most meaningful partnerships are forged not in comfort, but in the crucible of shared danger and mutual respect. As they sat together under the star-filled sky, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come west, looking for a husband, and found herself instead. She had sought safety and discovered courage. Most importantly, She had learned that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not when we find what we're looking for, but when we find the strength to become who we were always meant to be. The frontier was still dangerous, and tomorrow would bring new challenges. But Sarah Coleman was no longer afraid of the unknown. She had proven to herself and to the world that she possessed the kind of resilience that could weather any storm. And beside her stood a partner who valued her strength as much as her companionship. In the distance, the lights of Pinewood Valley twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing a family, a dream, a future worth protecting. Sarah had found her place in that constellation of hopes, not as someone seeking shelter, but as someone willing to stand guard over the dreams of others. The mail-order bride was gone forever, replaced by something far more powerful. A woman who had discovered that the greatest love stories aren't about finding someone to complete you, but about finding someone who inspires you to become the best version of yourself. In Deputy Tom Mitchell, Sarah had found exactly that kind of partnership, and in Pinewood Valley, she had found a home worth fighting for. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.